So you want to know whether something you make chairside in your office can be as good as a crown made by a dental lab? Let's talk about crowns right now. If you're new here, my name is Adam White. I'm a general dentist, and I started this channel to kind of give you guys a backstage look into my first 9 years in practice, some mistakes I've made, some things that I've learned, and ultimately just give you some hope and encouragement that dentistry it's not easy. It can be rewarding, but it comes with its own unique set of challenges. If you find yourself kind of stressed in the career or wondering if you could do things better, we have all been there. Ever since the first chairside milling units came out, and I think the first ones were CEREC, there's been this debate as to whether something made chairside in your office can be as good as something made by a dental lab. And I'll say this right now, the technology is at the point where you can make as good of restorations in your office than anything a lab will make. And I will stand by that. If you're doing zirconia, if you're doing porcelain, you're doing emax, you can do that in your office and it will be as good as something that comes back from the lab if you know what you're doing. Now, that being said, there are some things that you can't mill. You can't mill gold. You can't mill a porcelain fused to metal crown. And I still actually use gold and porcelain fused to metal on a fairly regular basis. You might hear some misconceptions that are still kind of hanging around about CAD CAM dentistry. There's this idea that if you have a CEREC, that you have to use kind of crappier materials than the lab uses. And that's just not true. I think the reason a lot of dentists think that, especially those that aren't familiar, is that the first dentist to use CEREC used feldspathic porcelain for almost everything. And so they would do like second molars with a feldspathic porcelain. So yeah, these things are going to break. They need really aggressive preps. You need a ton of occlusal clearance, and a lot of times they still break. The only reason anyone would use that material on a back tooth most of the time is because that's what's available. But now with CAD CAM, we have the option of doing emax, which is very strong, zirconia, which is extremely strong, and those are kind of the two workhorse materials for most doctors that are doing CAD CAM dentistry. And so if somebody says that you have to use worse materials if you're doing it in your office, they just don't know what they're talking about. So when comparing lab versus chairside, I don't think quality really factors in as much. I look at things like workflow, cost, patient perception. Is the technology fun to use? Those are all considerations for getting into CAD CAM dentistry versus sending things to the lab. Before the rest of the video, I will let you in on this right now. I actually bought a CEREC. I bought it used in 2015, and I sold it a couple years later because it's just not for me. It wasn't what I expected it to be. I did not like the workflow. I had a CEREC Blue Cam, which is like the previous generation of CEREC, where you actually had to spray powder in order to take the impression. That actually wasn't too big of an issue. I didn't mind the powder. We got some really good restorations, and I was doing most of my crowns in emax, which is a really strong material. But with emax, to get the most strength out of it, you have to bond it to the tooth. You can't just use a conventional cement. Bonding is a huge hassle. And I hate to say that because it makes me sound lazy, but I just don't like to bond crowns. There's so much margin for error. Right now, my go-to is a zirconia crown that's fabricated by the lab, and I cement it with a resin-modified glass ionomer because I can make sure the prep is clean, place the crown, and we're good. If I'm bonding, I have to use adhesives on the tooth. If you get a little bit of blood out of the sulcus, then it'll kind of go all over the tooth. You sort of have to start over. Bonding is a huge hassle. And the kicker for me, I found an amazing lab. I have great assistants. And so my workflow right now for crowns, I will walk in, I will numb the patient, prep the crown, start the impression, and then I'm done. The assistant will finish the temporary. They will cement the temporary. When the patient comes back, they will remove the temporary. They will try on the permanent crown, which 9 out of 10 times needs zero adjustment. So I walk in, check it, and cement it. Assistant cleans up the cement. That is it. When I was doing chairside CAD CAM, it was new. And so my assistants didn't know how to do that. And I know I could train them and that sort of thing, but it was all on me. I'm doing the scanning, I'm doing the design, which I would probably want to do anyway if I kept this going. I would have to mill the crown. Because it's emax, we have to fire it, but I would have to polish it before we put it in the oven. If there's any stain, I have to do that. And when it comes out of the oven, I have to clean it up, and then we have to bond it. It took a ton of time. And I know that you can do zirconia chairside now. And so potentially, in the future, I might consider that because I really like zirconia restorations. Zirconia is challenging to get to look right because it's such an opaque material. They require a ton of staining. It's a lot of work to get it to look right. The other consideration is the cost. To get into CAD CAM chairside milling now, there are a ton of companies that do it. CEREC is still kind of the one that everybody talks about, but there's some open source systems now. You can get into it a little bit cheaper. I think in some cases, maybe even $50,000 or $60,000, all the way up to maybe $150,000. That's a huge investment when you think about it. I actually bought my CEREC on eBay for $12,000, which is I didn't feel too bad about getting rid of it a couple years later. But it's a huge expense. And you do save a little bit. You save about, 15 bucks worth of impression material, scanning versus doing an impression. To make the crown costs you maybe $25 worth of materials instead of paying a lab, anywhere from 100 to 150 to do the crown. So if you're doing a ton of them, then the volume might pay off to consider, the cost of a CAD CAM unit. If you're doing a crown a day like I am on average, I don't think the volume is there. Unless you get something used, you can get into it for, under $20,000. But even then, it's almost a trade-off because you're going to spend a lot of time doing it. And if the volume's not there, you really don't have as much opportunity to sort of train your assistants on it. And so you're the one stuck doing the work. In terms of patient experience, to be honest, I think my patients had a better experience with a 2-visit crown because we just had our workflow down. Like I said, it was so smooth. I can walk in, prep, walk out. The assistants make great temporaries. They come back. It's a quick visit. They don't even have to get numb for. If they really wanted it same day, we could do it. But when I did those, it was, we were still in the learning curve process. Some of them, they were just there for, 2.5 hours because I've got this slow mill, I'm polishing, I'm adding glaze to it. We've got to fire it. We've got to bond it in. And the patient's just done. I would rather have somebody spend an hour and a half in my office and then maybe 10 minutes a couple weeks later than spend 2 hours in one visit where they're kind of getting a little burned out at the end. And I know you're going to talk to somebody that says, I have this down to a science. I can do start to finish in 1 hour, a chairside crown. Yeah, that's probably true. But to be honest, I don't buy that in a lot of cases. If I'm prepping an upper premolar that I've already put a core in, I can prep that in like 5 minutes. But today I had 2 crowns. Both of them were kind of the same situation where there's this incredibly deep interproximal decay with an existing core in it that I have to take out. So I'm taking out this old filling. I'm excavating decay. There's blood everywhere. There's a tongue in the way. You're not going to do that in 5 minutes. And if you're trying to do that chairside, you're fighting with all that mess. Now you've got to try to isolate that to get a scan. There's no way you're going to bond that cleanly. I don't care who you are. You could be a magician. If you have, sort of cheating a little bit on the biological width and you're basically down to the bone level, there's no good way to do that. But the worst way to do it is to try to bond it in with a resin cement. I still go to a zirconia crown with a regular cement in those cases. And what I find is the tissue actually responds fairly well to that. Even better would be something like porcelain fused to metal or gold if the patient will tolerate it. Where I think in-office milling would probably make a ton of sense is, number one, if you have a multiple doctor practice. And so you're sharing this thing with, 2 or 3, 4 other doctors. I think that makes a ton of sense because, like I said, if I had one in my office right now, I would probably use it on maybe 1 out of every 4 crowns. And so if you're doing a ton of crowns, this thing is getting use every day. And for the patients that's getting used on, it's a good experience for them. And then for the other, 75% of whatever I would do, we just do standard crowns and people are used to it. But that is another consideration if your patients expect it. So maybe they came from an office, and I had that happen to me where a dentist down the road from me who retired, he's a really good dentist and he had a CEREC, and people expect that I would now because they're used to coming in for 1 visit. Now they have to come back for 2. The other thing to consider, and this is kind of the trap I fell into because I thought I was going to be the big tech geek because I'm a huge geek. And I thought I would get this technology in my office and I would just geek out like crazy. Patients are kind of seeing me, do my thing on the computer and I'm like this wizard making teeth. In reality, the novelty wore off after like the first 3 crowns and it just became part of the workflow. Just like anything else, once you get used to it, it's just not that amazing anymore. I mean, think of the first crown prep you did or the first tooth you took out, how amazing that was. And now it's like, okay, this again. That's kind of what happens with the CAD CAM stuff. So the conclusion for me, and the reason that I sold my CEREC was the workflow just wasn't there for me. My volume is not high enough to justify training my assistants in that. And my patient population just didn't really, expect that part of the experience. One thing I do miss is the digital impressions. And I think if I do make another big purchase in my office anytime soon, it would be a scanner. And so that's kind of the best of both worlds if you're using a lab. As long as I can scan the margin, I can just basically upload it to a lab. They usually give you a discount because you're not sending them an impression and they have to pour it up. Then the lab will mill the crown. They will do all their beautiful staining and glazing and kind of polish it, make sure everything looks nice, and send you the crown. So it is still 2 visits, but the patient doesn't have the impression stuff. And so for that reason, and then also digitizing models for orthodontics and even bite splints and stuff like that, I definitely see the value in a scanner. If I had to do it again, I would probably just get a scanner first and use that, and then maybe later decide to add a mill to it if it felt like that was something that I needed to do. As always, agree, disagree, drop it down in the comments. See you guys on the next one.